Hello, Dr. Brazil. Welcome to our virtual newsroom. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Dr. Brazil, Matt, you are a non-resident fellow at the Jamestown Foundation now, but before that, you also worked in Asia for over 20 years, first as a U.S. Army intelligence officer and then as an American diplomat based in Beijing. And you also had a career as a corporate security investigator. So that's a very long and extensive list of experience. Can I just invite you to, introduce yourself a little bit more? How did you get to know China and got interested in the country? And why did you end up in China and why did you leave?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Please call me Matt. So when I was a kid, I'm dating myself, but the Cultural Revolution started when I was 10. And I was fascinated by it. And I lived in the Bay Area here, the San Francisco Bay Area, very close to San Francisco. And so I began to bug my parents to take me to Chinatown as often as possible. And my brother Mark and I co-conspired in that endeavor. But the best route I thought to learning about China, besides talking to Chinese people, was the library. So I began to read everything I could. I ended up studying Chinese politics as an undergraduate and as a graduate, and later doing a doctoral dissertation on the early history of the Chinese Communist intelligence services.
Yeah, interesting. So I wanted to start by chatting a little bit about an article you recently published jointly with Daily Beast and Spy Talk. It's called A Detective in China, a memoir of sleuthing out trade cheating. Can you just introduce us to that article a little bit? How did you get to those cat and mouse games with Chinese firms, and what did you find there?
Well, I started off on that doing it from a distance at the U.S. Commerce Department. I was working for a small police agency, which is still out there. It's called the Office of Export Enforcement, and I was their China specialist. And so the U.S. government had then and still has a program called the pre-license check program. What on earth is that? What kind of license are we talking about? Not a driver license, but rather export licenses. So if a consignee, a buyer, or an end user rather, is named on an export license and they come under some sort of suspicion on the part of the US government, then the US government might decide to check the background of that consignee or that end user. Sometimes the check is superficial, sometimes it turns into a book-length study, and sometimes it leads to a request to a US diplomatic post overseas to go and visit the end user and see what they're doing. Are they really the sort of end user as described on the export license? And the nature of the end user can often lead to approval or denial of that export license application. And it's not just anything that we're talking about, the commodities concerned that are being exported. Mm-hmm. These are commodities that are useful in national defense, that could be misused against human rights, things that would be identified as a foreign policy concern. It's not only weaponry, but it's a lot of dual use items. It could be used to make, as I like to say, bubblegum or bombs.
Right. Yeah, interesting. And can you sort of recall one or two incidents during that trip that was especially memorable to you?
Yeah, the trip you're bringing up was to an institute in a northern Chinese province. And the institute apparently was on somebody's list back in Washington because I received a request to go see it. And there was interest as well from the military attache's office at the embassy. So friend of mine who worked there, and I went to this place, and it was a place that wanted to buy semiconductor manufacturing equipment that makes computer chips, right? And so we wanted to discover, did they have a civilian end use in mind, or did they not? And in the course of visiting the location, the institute, fell into my hands by accident. We came across information in the form of mil spec or military specification electronic parts labeled secret that had been hastily put away before I walked into the records room.
I see. So, from your experience, how prevalent is that? Is it just like a one-off incident, or do you think it's something more systematic that you observed during that trip?
I think the important thing to remember about China, which Xi Jinping himself likes to say, is that the party controls everything, north, south, east, and west, the government, the military, and the civilian population. The party leads everything. And that's really been true during the entire existence of the Chinese Communist Party. And so the party coordinates activities that are of interest to it. And when it comes to what is being called today in China military-civilian fusion, then the party coordinates the use of civilian industry for military purposes. And so in the time when I made that visit a long time ago, 1991, 92 actually, which was not long after the Tiananmen Square incident, the US had very tight controls on selling anything to the Chinese military. And so that's why we were there. And of course, when the party is in control of as much as it can control, then that means it's easier to hide things.
I see. So, speaking of espionage and also this civilian military fusion strategy that has been going on for a while. So I read your book, Chinese Communist Espionage and Intelligence Primer, this book published in 2019, which is sort of this encyclopedia-like book on China's history of espionage activities. So, the book, the majority of the book is about history, but I wanted to talk a little bit about present days. We know many countries conduct espionage activities. So how is China's espionage operation different from those countries? Especially, how is it different under Xi Jinping's era of Chinese politics?
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing about espionage is that people like to call it the second oldest profession. And the reason for that is that everyone does it. Espionage was featured in the Bible. Espionage is conducted by any country that can afford it and that feels it has a need, and most countries feel they have a need to know things that are not made public so that they can make more informed decisions. Now, the United States certainly does plenty of this, and you can go online, for example, and if you do the right search words, then you can find all sorts of interesting jobs online by the U.S. government and by contractors to the U.S. government. There's if you type in open source intelligence analyst, for example, you'll find that the U.S. government has such people who do the same sorts of things that we've heard about that China does, going on to social networks and making friends with people who are of interest to a government. But one of the differences between China and the rest of the world is that they have their own things that they're interested in that other governments tend not to pursue. In particular, technology and economic benefit. So, as I think your viewers know, every 5 years there's a 5-year plan. We're entering into the 14th 5-year plan now. From 2021 to 2025. And the elements of the 5-year plan, the targets, the goals in the 5-year plan, figure prominently into economic espionage.
Right. So I guess one question we have here is, how would you sort of discern a normal academic exchange activity from that kind of activity that's considered illegal or sort of in the realm of espionage or against US laws? Where do we draw the line?
I think the easiest line to find is secrecy. So when, of course, there are corporate secrets that are kept for reasons of preserving a company's market position. Big companies keep secrets from each other because they don't want other companies to know what they're doing and perhaps give up a market advantage. At the same time, secrecy is apparent in every single Department of Justice indictment that I've read lately concerning this sort of problem. If you take the case, for example, that's has yet to go to trial, the accusation concerning a Harvard professor who was involved in transferring technology to the Wuhan University of Technology and was allegedly given a high salary in order to secretly move that technology over to China. One of the aspects of this case is that he was under contract with the U.S. government to produce some of this research. And so that is another aspect that is often present in these indictments, that some U.S. government institution has funded research, but the researcher in the university decides to double dip, to sell it overseas, as well as to conduct the research on behalf of the U.S. government. And of course, that's a misuse of taxpayer money. And in the case of some of the research, there are military applications.
I see. I wanted to talk a little bit about the case of Huawei. It has been going on for a couple of years, starting from the end of 2018, when Meng Wanzhou was caught in Canada under U.S. guidance. So, when we talk about the case of Huawei, I think we hear this controversy. On one hand, we have this notion that, okay, Huawei is basically a spy firm acting on behalf of CCP's interest. And there's also another line of reasoning saying that, okay, so the U.S. is going after Huawei because the U.S. does not have a relatively strong, competitive position in the realm of 5G, while Huawei is the potential leader in the 5G world. So, from a professional perspective, which line of reasoning do you think is correct in the case of Huawei?
Even figures like Michael Hayden, the former director of CIA and NSA, have come out and given rather vague warnings about Huawei. And so it's not just the Trump administration and their deal-making tendency in the way they viewed diplomacy. It seems also to be a national security concern. And why is this? I think the things that are visible that we know are that Huawei is a national champion. It's not a state-owned enterprise as far as I can tell, anyway. But it's been identified as a national champion, and so it gets a lot of help from the PRC government and from the party. And indeed, it doesn't matter what sort of business you're in China, whether you're a Chinese-owned business or you're a foreign enterprise, or even an office with 10 people. You're required under law to have a Chinese Communist committee that's part of your business. And these committees are typically headed by important people. If it's a foreign business, they're not necessarily headed by the American in charge, because there aren't that many Americans in the Chinese Communist Party. But getting back to Huawei, yes, of course, they seem to have an advantage in 5G, and it's a commercial advantage. And even Ericsson, for example, if we're looking purely at commercial interest, Ericsson in Sweden has lobbied the Swedish government to allow Huawei equipment in, because they know that if they don't use Huawei equipment, they won't have the latest 5G technology, and the rest of the world is behind in that. At the same time, I think what the U.S. is concerned about is not so much Chinese commercial expansion and competitive advantage as they are the use of Huawei by Chinese government agencies to conduct espionage of one sort or another. And of course, since 2014, there have been, I think it's 5 laws that have been enacted in China, including the counterintelligence law, the intelligence law, and others, cybersecurity law as well, that compel Chinese citizens and organizations, and indeed anybody on Chinese soil, to cooperate if they are asked to participate in an intelligence or counterintelligence operation. So these are the stated reasons. that we hear from the US side about why they want to limit Huawei's reach around the world. At the same time, though, I think the US government needs to do a much better job than they're doing of getting specific about why this should be done. Because if Ericsson can't be convinced to not use Huawei equipment in Sweden, then forget it. There isn't enough evidence to convince people to avoid that company.
I see. I wanted to talk a little about this agency, the MSS. So we've heard a lot about the agency, what it does, its sort of extensive realm of activities. But I think in a recent blog post you posted on your site, you had this discussion about Chen Wenqing, the new head of MSS. What do we know about Chen Wenqing and why is he different from the previous heads of MSS?
He seems to be more competent and less corrupt, to start with. There wasn't that much known about him, and there still isn't really that much known about him. However, he seems, as we put it in our article in the headline, he seems to be a working class hero. Why am I saying that? It's because he was a kid during the Cultural Revolution. His education was interrupted. He wasn't able to take the college entrance exam until he was 20. But when he did, he aced it, according to state-owned media. And when it comes to stuff like that, they tend not to tell falsehoods. They tend to stick to the actual story when it comes to biographies. But anyway, he wanted to be a cop like his father. And indeed, he was an award-winning cop. And he was involved in, he had to have been involved in a lot of difficult incidents during this time because there was a lot of civil unrest in the parts of Sichuan where he was based, working for public security, the Gong'an. But then he had the chance to join state security, and he started to move up from there. Now, he was only in state security for, I think it was 8 years. The article has the exact number, but then he was picked up by the Central Committee's Discipline Inspection Commission. Now, the Central Committee's Discipline Inspection Commission, as I think your viewers know, is charged with doing investigations on internal corruption. Whenever the word discipline is used by the Chinese Communist Party, it normally refers to a lack of discipline, in other words, corrupt behavior. And he was doing important investigations that nabbed some high-ranking people in the early 2000s when China was going through what I would think, around 2000 especially, was the worst part of what I like to call their corruption crisis. And then he apparently got to know Xi Jinping and moved up from there, and he was named to be the state security minister. So it appears that he's a really competent and dedicated individual. It appears that he is also not corrupt. And so that can be a rare thing at times. It's less rare now. Under Xi Jinping, the other shoe has dropped, so to speak. It's no longer so easy to engage in corrupt activity. Of course, a lot of the investigations by the Discipline Inspection Commission have been targeted against Xi Jinping's rivals rather than his family or his allies. Nonetheless, Xi is now rather popular among some people anyway in China for cleaning things up.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, the last 4 years, the relationship between US and China seemed to be especially tumultuous. And I think, people across the political spectrum wanted to give the Trump administration some credit for finally standing up to China's bad behaviors. But in terms of the strategy or the actions that actually took place, I think it's very controversial. Sort of looking back at the past 4 years of the Trump administration and looking at the Trump administration's strategy to China, what are some of the highlights? What are some of the pluses and what are some of the weaknesses?
I think when it comes to calling out things like technology theft and increasingly aggressive foreign policy behavior, certainly that's been a good thing. However, I think mistakes were made in the way diplomacy was conducted. One of the issues that any government dealing with the People's Republic needs to face is the sensitivities, the sensibilities regarding foreign relations that other countries tend not to have. And the reason for this can be traced back to the so-called 100 years of humiliation, the century of humiliation. And this makes Chinese not only foreign policy officials and political leaders, but also the general population quite touchy when it comes to dealing with foreign powers. And so my own experience as a low-level diplomat, I was charged with maintaining a relationship with the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Economic Cooperation in Beijing in order to make sure that we could do these checks and maximize legal technology exports to China. And that was a difficult task. However, there was never a moment when I ever thought of leaking anything to the press. There was never a moment when I ever thought of making a public statement and shaming the Chinese side. Instead, what we would do was, if we were met with difficulties, we would return the favor. The best thing to do when dealing with, I think history shows this, the best thing to do when dealing with Beijing is to, people like to say quiet diplomacy, and that sort of sounds limp-wristed, but quiet diplomacy, whether or not it involves consequences, is usually the best way, because the fewer people involved in diplomacy, the better. That sounds pretty awful on the surface. Shouldn't these things be vetted by the people, etc.? But the problem is that there's so much sensitivity on the Chinese side that the more people you get involved with, it's even worse than it is in any other government. The more people you get involved, the more difficult it is to make any progress on anything. And so I think that we'll see a return to normal confidential diplomacy under the Biden administration. And it doesn't seem like he's going to let up either. I took a walk this morning and passed by the newsstand that had the World Journal, and it had it said something like Biden tells China, 中国确定我们, something like that.
Right.
And so it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to turn back to the previous decent relations between the two sides, unless both sides are able to cooperate with each other and lower the tensions. And I think that can only really happen in private.
I see. So interesting. Speaking about sort of the Biden administration's stance against China, in his first foreign policy address, given just, a few days ago, President Biden called China America's most serious competitor, and also, called out on China's behavior on, violations of human rights, stealing of intellectual property, and its global ambition. So at least, on the surface, we seem to hear this sort of stronger and tougher stance against China. But in terms of what's actually the best line of strategy and action, I think, there are still some debates even within the administration on the best way to tackle the China challenge. So, if you were to advise the Biden administration on sort of giving a China strategy, what are some of your action items that you would propose?
Well, you're getting beyond my scope of study here. I think, first of all, one of the long-range problems that we face and that China faces concerns Taiwan. And so this, I think, is the most important bilateral issue between the United States and China, even though it has not been always at the top concern. And the reason is that the Chinese Communist Party now seems to have a plan to pursue all means short of war, as I think it's been called by an Australian journal recently. And what does that mean? That means that that at present, due to good use of five-year plan priorities, China now has what one analyst I recently talked to called a minimal capability to invade Taiwan, but it probably wouldn't succeed if the US intervened. However, there's always the 14th five-year plan and the 15th five-year plan. And as one other analyst I spoke to recently said, we may be right now at peak China. That is, China's highest level of national power in relation to the rest of the world, that may now begin to decline because of demographic reasons, because of financial problems in China with increasing unserviceable debt, and also because of internal civil disturbances that continue. We don't hear about the number of civil disturbances anymore because the Ministry of Public Security stopped publishing them. They were going up at a 45-degree angle up until about 2010, I think it was. So China may be approaching a time when they decide they have to make or break the Taiwan issue. And the US is going to be involved in this one way or the other. So that's certainly a priority, to avoid war between the two sides, and also to avoid seeing 20 plus million people who live in a free society being placed into an unfree society, as we saw in Hong Kong. But the United States and China have some common interests. We both are interested in suppressing terrorism. We do both, I hope we both want to limit nuclear proliferation, especially in difficult parts of the world. That hasn't always been a priority for the Chinese side, but it's something that we've been able to bring to their attention and obtain occasional cooperation on. As well, China's expansion into the South China Sea and its conduct concerning its neighbors is a very important issue as well, because without stability in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, we could eventually see conflict between China and its immediate neighbors, in particular Japan. So these things have to be addressed in a positive way that does not rub China's nose in it. In other words, doesn't back them into a corner. We have to continue to press on these issues. And China policy in this government, I've noticed, is mostly bipartisan. The only outlier has been the business community, with its emphasis on quarterly profits and its short-sighted attitude concerning these matters, and its lack of ability to see their own country's national interests as being important to their shareholders. But beyond that, China policy has been, I think, admirably bipartisan compared to other policy areas.
Yeah. So thank you so much for all the insights. It's been such a helpful conversation. Thank you so much, Matt. It's been great talking to you. And in the future, we'll make sure to invite you back for future topics as they arise. And I'm sure there will be plenty in the next couple of years as the relationship between U.S. and China evolve. Thank you so much.
You've been very kind. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you.